What do you do when the man who stood beside you your whole life takes the stand and swears you're a monster? 10 years ago, my marriage was ending, and my daughter was the only thing I cared about holding on to. The custody hearing was already brutal before anything else happened. Then my own best friend since ninth grade, Danny, walked into that courtroom and asked to testify. For one stupid second, I actually felt relieved, like he'd come to vouch for me. He didn't. He sat in that chair, voice cracking, and described watching me shake my daughter during what he called one of my episodes. He had texts. He had video clips, cut and rearranged until every happy memory looked like evidence of cruelty. I turned to my wife, Renee, expecting her to object. Instead, she dabbed at fake tears like she'd rehearsed the whole scene. My own lawyer looked at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. I lost everything that day. No visitation. No calls, nothing. I don't remember driving home. I remember the bottle, though, and I remember calling Danny hammered out of my mind, demanding to know why he'd just burned my life to the ground. He laughed, cold, satisfied. I've wanted Renee for years, man. You know how I get when I want something. Then Renee grabbed the phone and told me almost cheerfully that he'd be a better father than I ever was, that I'd never see my daughter again. She admitted they'd been together for 2 years, that the whole abuse story had been built brick by brick specifically to take her from me. I should have fought back right then. Instead, I packed up, moved states away, and just existed. I sent birthday cards every year, letters, small gifts. Never once heard back. I told myself she probably believed whatever poison Renee was feeding her about me, and I made peace or something close to it, with maybe never being her father again in any way that counted. Then a hospital called my daughter, Reagan, 16 now, had been in a car accident, and somehow I was still listed as her emergency contact. I didn't stop to ask why. I got in the car and drove, hands shaking on the wheel the entire way. Walking into that waiting room, I found Renee and Danny frozen mid-conversation, clearly not expecting me to ever show up again. Renee excused herself toward the nurse's station almost immediately, leaving me alone with him. For a second, I thought he might actually apologize. Instead, he leaned back like we were catching up over beers. I never gave her your letters, he said, almost proud of it. Told her you walked away. Wasn't hard to sell. Then, shifting gears entirely, he tried on this wounded, put-upon voice. I'll admit, I've been rough with her sometimes. Kids push you. Honestly, you should be thanking me. She's a handful. I'm doing you a favor letting you back in. I was one. Word away from putting my fist through his face when a small voice cut through the curtain beside. Reagan was awake. I don't fully remember crossing the room. She was smaller than I'd pictured in my head for a decade, and somehow bigger too. 16, bandage wrapped around her head, arm in a cast. Eyes the exact shade of brown as mine, her hair longer and darker than the last photo I'd ever seen of her. Dad, she whispered, and that single word nearly took my legs out from under me. I wanted to hug her but was terrified of hurting her further, so I just stood there frozen, memorizing her face like it might vanish if I blinked too long. Renee came storming back with a nurse and tried to physically wedge herself between us. He's not family, she snapped. The nurse, understandably confused, asked Reagan directly who she wanted with her. I want my dad, Reagan said, quiet, certain. Renee and Danny's faces went slack. The nurse ushered them out without argument. Once we were alone, I pulled a chair up to the bed. 10 years of things I'd planned to say evaporated the second I actually needed them. They told me you left, Reagan finally said. That you didn't want me. That was never true, I told her. I wrote you every month for 10 years. I never got anything. A tear slipped down her cheek. Did you really hurt me when I was little? Mom always said you had a temper. Never, not once. Danny lied in court to help your mom win. He wanted her for himself, saying, it out loud still turned my stomach. She told me she'd found a shoebox in the attic weeks earlier. Photos of the two of us that didn't match the story she'd grown up believing, and a stack of open letters with her name on them. That's how she'd memorized my number. That's why she'd listed me as her emergency contact. Not even sure if it still worked. Before I could respond, a doctor walked in. Concussion, broken arm, some bruising. Lucky given how the car had hit that tree. When I asked who'd been driving, Reagan's voice dropped. Danny, he was mad, driving too fast. I told him to slow down, and it just made him worse. The doctor's expression told me there were already concerns being logged about her home situation. I told him plainly, I'm her father, and I want to help. We talked for almost an hour after he left. Art, a best friend named Priya who'd stood by her through everything, wanting to study design one day. I told her stories she'd never had access to, how she used to refuse to take off her rain boots even in July, how she once tried to liberate every goldfish from a pet store because she thought they looked lonely. Leaving that night felt like ripping something open again. In the hallway, Danny blocked my path, smug despite the bandage on his own forehead. Enjoy the reunion. Won't last. I told him Reagan knew everything now, that she'd found the letters. Worry flickered across his face for half a second before he recovered. Prove it. Nobody believed you then, nobody will now. Then quieter, meaner. One call to the cops about you harassing us and you're done. I sat in my car outside that hospital for a long time before calling my old lawyer and checking into a motel. Sleep wasn't really an option. The next morning, Reagan looked stronger, and for the first time in a decade, she smiled when she saw me walk in. We kept filling in the gaps. She told me Danny had found out she'd been digging through the attic and grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises. Not the first time. She showed me the fading marks on her upper arm. The hospital had already asked about them. Around noon, I ran into Renee in the cafeteria. She looked sharper somehow, harder around the mouth than I remembered. "You need to leave," she hissed. I told her Reagan wanted me there, and that wasn't changing. When I mentioned the letters, panic flashed across her face before she buried it. Those were from a dangerous man. I was protecting her. I didn't bother arguing anymore. I just told her Reagan was old enough now to see through it herself, and walked away. Back in the room, a caseworker named Priya Ramos, no relation to Reagan's friend, just an odd coincidence, and was already there. Young, sharp-eyed professional. The hospital had flagged concerns based on what Reagan told staff and the accident circumstances. She asked careful questions, and Reagan answered everyone honestly. The bruises, Danny's drinking, the crash itself. He was yelling at me about the dishes. Told me we needed to talk about my attitude on a drive. I told him to slow down, and it made him angrier. He missed the curve. Her hands shook telling it, but her voice stayed level. By evening, Renee and Danny showed up demanding to see her. Reagan tensed immediately. "I don't want to see them." I told the nurse as much and went out to face them myself. Danny, sporting a neck brace now, accused me of calling CPS out of spite. "The hospital did that on its own," I said. "Standard procedure when abuse is suspected." He shoved a finger toward my chest, hissing that it was my word against theirs, that they had a decade-old court ruling backing them. Renee tried the wounded mother act on a passing nurse who wasn't buying it either. I slept in the chair beside Reagan's bed that night. Uncomfortable didn't begin to cover it, but there was no universe where I was leaving her alone in that building. The following morning, the caseworker came back with harder facts. Bruising patterns inconsistent with the crash, and Danny's blood alcohol level well over the legal limit at the time of the accident. She asked if I had somewhere Reagan could stay while the investigation continued. I said yes, without hesitation. Spare room, stable job, no history of anything they were accusing me of, aside from a decade-old custody ruling I explained had been built entirely on Danny's false testimony. That complicated things, she admitted, but she'd make calls. That afternoon, a police officer showed up to question me. Danny had filed a report claiming I was harassing them, coaching Reagan into lying. I laid out the truth, that I hadn't spoken to my daughter in 10 years until 3 days ago, that she'd told hospital staff about the abuse before I ever walked through the door. The officer noted everything down without much reaction, warned me to be careful making accusations, and left me standing in the hallway feeling like I was reliving the exact same nightmare from a decade earlier. By evening, the caseworker returned with approval for temporary placement, pending a background check and home visit. Reagan's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since I arrived. Discharge day came fast. Wheeling her toward the exit, we found Renee and Danny waiting by the doors. "Where do you think you're taking our daughter?" Renee snapped, blocking the wheelchair. I held up the paperwork. A security guard reviewed it, found it in order, and asked them to step aside. Danny nearly lost it entirely before the guard threatened to remove him from the property. We drove off with Renee's threat. "This isn't over," trailing behind us. 5 hours later, we pulled up outside my apartment. Modest, a little worn around the edges, but clean and quiet. Reagan looked around like she was memorizing it. "I've never had my own room," she admitted. I shared with the baby. That's how I learned about Tyler, her 3-year-old half-brother, treated, in her words, like Danny's real kid. "You're my real kid," I told her. "And you deserve better than you've gotten." That night, the caseworker called with a warning. Renee and Danny had lawyered up, demanding the placement be reversed, claiming manipulation. Nothing changed for now, but a hearing was coming. Then Reagan's friend called. Priya, 16, nervous on the phone. Renee and Danny had shown up at her house grilling her, trying to get her to recant. She'd told them the truth instead, that she'd seen the bruises, that Reagan had cried describing what Danny did. And there was more. Reagan had given her letters and photos months earlier to hide, terrified Danny would find them first. Letters proving Reagan had discovered the truth about me long before the accident. Proof her story wasn't coached. It predated me entirely. My lawyer called it exactly what it was, the missing piece. If we could show Reagan found those letters before contacting me, her whole account gained a different kind of weight. Then came the lawsuit. Renee and Danny filing for emergency custody, claiming I'd manipulated Reagan through phone calls that never happened, that I was unstable, citing the decade-old ruling as proof. Reagan wasn't even surprised. "That's what they do," she said. "Lie until it works." The hearing arrived faster than I was ready for. Same courthouse, same stone steps as 10 years earlier, Same knot in my stomach walking through those heavy wooden doors. The night before, Reagan and I had sat on the couch pretending to watch a movie neither of us was following. What if they win? She asked at one point, voice small. What if I have to go back? I pulled her closer and told her that wasn't happening. Not this time. Not ever again. Even though some part of me wasn't entirely sure I could keep that promise. Renee and Danny showed up looking scrubbed clean and respectable. Their lawyer painting me as a manipulative father exploiting a tragedy to alienate a daughter from the parents who'd actually raised her. She suggested, with a straight face, that the bruises documented at the hospital could have come from ordinary teenage clumsiness. My lawyer, when his turn came, laid out the real timeline instead, the hospital's documentation, the caseworker's findings, Priya's statement, and the letters Reagan hid months before any of this happened. Proof she'd uncovered the truth long before she ever dialed my number. The judge asked to speak with Reagan alone in his chambers. The wait felt endless. Renee kept shooting me looks across the room while Danny stared straight ahead, jaw locked tight, and I found myself wondering how I'd ever mistaken this man for a friend. Reagan came back red-eyed but steady and gave me a small nod that told me she'd told him everything. Then it happened. Danny, rattled by the mounting evidence, snapped mid-objection. You don't understand what we were dealing with. She's been trouble since he left. Then, digging himself deeper, we did what we had to do back then. He was going to take her. We couldn't let that happen. The room went dead silent. Even his own lawyer flinched. The judge ordered a full review of the original custody case, referred Danny for possible perjury and child endangerment charges, and kept Reagan placed with me while the case proceeded. Outside the courthouse, I found Renee standing alone, her composure finally cracked. I asked her simply why. She admitted Danny had convinced her I'd poison Reagan against them if I ever got access, and that somewhere along the way she'd started believing her own lie. It wasn't an excuse. I told her so and walked away. Danny eventually took a plea deal. Child endangerment, DUI, probation, a sentence that felt too light for what he'd done but at least put his name on record. Renee filed for divorce and, surprising me, didn't contest my custody petition. Reagan settled into a life that actually looked like a life. We painted her room the pale green she picked, argued good-naturedly over curtain colors, and spent a Saturday afternoon assembling a bookshelf from a box with instructions that made no sense to either of us. She started online classes to finish the year strong, staying up late some nights working through assignments at the kitchen table, while I graded nothing but still sat with her for company. Priya came to visit, and the sound of two teenagers laughing too loud in the next room became my favorite noise in the world, proof that somewhere underneath everything, she still got to just be 16. One evening, chopping vegetables side by side, Reagan asked if I was still angry at her mother. I told her I used to be. Now I was just sad about the years we'd lost. She mentioned Renee had called to apologize, crying through it. Part of me wants to forgive her, she said. Is that okay? I told her it was more than okay. Her mother's choices weren't hers to carry, and forgiveness, whenever it came, would be entirely hers to give or withhold. 2 months later, the judge finalized permanent custody in my favor. Renee got supervised visitation, which Reagan chose to try. Danny was gone from the picture entirely, serving out his probation somewhere I stopped tracking. We drove back one last time so Reagan could collect the rest of her things. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the yard gone to weeds. Renee met us at the door, sober and tired, and apologized again. For the lies, for staying with a man she knew was hurting her daughter. I didn't tell her it was fine because it wasn't, but I let her ask about visiting Tyler, and told her that door could stay open if Reagan wanted it to. Half a year later, I came home to find Reagan spreading photographs across the dining table for a school project about memory. Baby pictures, toddler years. Then a gap, 10 years wide, bridged only by the handful of letters and photos she'd rescued from that attic. They're not really missing, she said, tapping the edge of the timeline. Just hidden for a while. I picked up one photo. Reagan at 4, perched on my shoulders at the zoo, both of us laughing at something long forgotten. I set it back exactly where she'd placed it. The years we lost were gone for good, but the ones ahead were finally entirely ours.